Hi, this is David Halem, and you're listening to Rain Cloistered from my story Status Stranded. I hope you enjoy. What the fuck just happened? I just pushed Kenocha out of the way of... That was so long ago, but it just happened. It must have fallen on me, but I don't feel dead. I'm certain that this is not what death looks like. The afterlife may be pretty, but I feel like it shouldn't look like this. In this strange freefall that I'm suspended in, the ground is everywhere. The sky is everywhere as well. Not like floating islands, but the sky and ground coexist in the same space. Because of this coexistence, it feels like I'm falling, but I'm also on solid ground. There are places where the coexistence isn't so potent, and those places appear to take the form of vibrant colored clouds. The colors that radiated and flowed from these clouds in every direction were assortments of deep purples, bright magentas, glistening forest greens, rich blues, charcoal oranges, all within their swirls and graceful, organic formations in this strange space. I heard a commotion below me, and when I looked down at the commotion, I was greatly taken aback by the strange sight that I saw. There was a human-like being or entity that was completely red from head to toe. He was wearing robes colored like the sky I grew up with, that burning blue with gray. He was of massive size, like that of a planet, and he was contorting and roaring in immense discomfort. No, pain and discomfort are too weak of words to describe what this being was going through. There were green, white, and black plumes of dust and fluids surging out of the pores and other holes of this immense being. Dust and otherwise coming from his eyes, nose, ears, mouth, and I can assume that there were massive amounts of this dust and fluids coming from his anus and dick. Another disturbing revelation that I discovered. As the dust and fluids came from this being, he grew smaller and smaller, to the point where his bones were impressions in his flesh. This thing continued to tear and destroy him until he was a barely sentient mass of skin and bones, and then he was thrown to the side. How do I move? And with the thought, I was suddenly in the presence of this weakened entity. Once a planetary scale individual, now stood mere feet taller than me. There were sparks and almost charcoal glowing through his veins, almost like a fire. There were odd-colored tears falling off his face, slowly drifting in every direction. His lip was quivering, and his bald head seemed shriveled as the vibrant colors shone on his depressed demeanor. He struggled to get any words out. I was so close to having a Soteras. I was bewildered. I began to ask something, but there was a flash of light and a growling noise. Both myself and this being looked towards where the sound erupted from, and there was a large red bear with aged gray lines in his fur. He was the planetary scale and size that this being used to be, but instead of getting smaller, this old-looking bear grew bigger. He was holding an extravagant glowing core, and he was holding it up in one hand. There were dust and fluids that rushed into the shining multicolored core, and as this material flowed into the core, that is when the aged bear grew bigger and stronger. I turned my attention back to the former red being. Are you going to die? I asked him with a strange kind of genuine in my tone. He shook his head. No, I still have the fire of my society alive out beyond. It was then that I noticed he had glowing sparks darting about his skin. He was covered in little sparks. He sighed, and it shook with his uneasiness. The mother of my Soteras. He held out his hand, and one of the sparks grew to the size of my head, and it turned into a flame. Through the flame, I could see a Fortis woman. Her stomach was small, but there was a bump big enough for her to show that she was expecting a baby. She was on one of the Fortis ships. Odd-colored tears flowing down her face as she avoided looking out the windows. Outside the windows, there was a massive snake destroying spade and club-shaped ships, ripping them to pieces and scattering the shredded pieces into the void. There was also a golden sphere that looked like it was made of twine. Despite all this, the young pregnant girl kept her eyes closed and gently stroked her stomach. The being, with a shaking hand, moved 2 of his fingers, and the scenery in the palm of his hand disappeared. And in its place were 2 sparks, a scarlet-colored spark and a smaller golden-colored spark. I was amazed by everything I saw, but I had to ask, "Why are you showing me this?" The sparks in his hand went back to their normal size, and left his shaking hand extended in the air. "If you were the proud father of millions of beautiful children, all doomed to die, wouldn't you show with exuberance their savior?" To that, I can't say I wouldn't, but I don't think I would ever be in a position like that. I couldn't leave his statement hanging. I suppose I would. He nodded and lowered his head in sadness. "I see that your sights and aspirations are elsewhere, and your elsewhere to satisfy your sights is over there yonder." He pointed with a shaking finger, away from the old bear with a glowing core, and towards a strangely shaped gate. The gate was a color I had never seen before, but it seemed out of the question that it should have been a color that I was familiar with. The shape of the gate was like that of a rose, those strange colored beams making the lines of each petal of the rose. I had concluded that with a thought I could be there, but first I had to ask this being an important question. "Grand Sir, am I dead?" He looked at me with a calm look in his eye. He shook his head. "If you were, you would have found yourself in the sepulchre below." I looked down, and there was a desert as far as the eye could see, red sand dunes the size of mountains, dotted with white sparks. I understood a little more, but still not enough. So down there is where the dead people go. The desert sepulchre with massive dunes, all for the dead to wander forever. I looked up at the rose-shaped gates. That is where I'm told I should go. But below, people I love and people I hate. No, people I detest with a burning passion. I could go down there and meet them. I would love to see Father again, but at the cost of finding Mother. Or worse, Mother finding me. Ellie's family is down there too. Her father. Her dear father. I looked below and found the gates of the sepulchre. A frosted white piece of architecture. And with a thought, I was there. The structure of the gates was like nothing I had ever seen. There were parts of the gate that seemed to reach backwards, but as they reached back, they connected to another part of the structure in front of them. Everything seemed backwards as I looked at the chilled white gate. I looked away from the gate and looked forward, and before me was a creature that seemed to hold full cosmic power as it flowed through its veins. Oddly enough, I knew what I was looking at as I looked at it. What it's called, the Gardener. He stood 40 feet tall and had a body of a man. But that's a very loose observation. His arms were like that of gorillas, legs like a bull, chest with a crest of silver feathers, and claws on his hands protruding no shorter than 4 feet from his wrists. He had two sets of wings like vulture wings that were as silver as the feathers on his chest, and his head was an animal skull. Whatever animal it was, it had two long tusks that came from his face that were again made of silver, but there appeared to be runes of some kind written all over the tusks in each rows. The skull may have been an elephant skull. I approached the gate with mild caution, and as I stepped forward, I noticed that I couldn't simply think and find myself where I wanted to be. The gardener stared at me as I walked through the gates into the sepulchre. A tingling sensation prodded up my spine as he spoke. "If any of the dead dare to escape as your company, I will overcome them." His chilling voice croaked and had no echo to it. The voice simply had a hollow sound. I regained myself and kept walking. "Understood," he said with no difference in his tone, but only the word itself was enough to knock me off kilter. I nodded. Understood. I stepped into the sepulchre. The scale of the mountainous sand dunes were amplified by the low level that I was at. They reached upwards taller than any mountains I had ever seen on Earth or otherwise. Everywhere there were white sparks, but I could see the sparks as people now, not just humans, but numerous races of aliens within the sparks. I approached one of the sparks, and the spirit of the alien looked at me. He was completely red in his humanoid figure, and he had no hair on him at all. My heart sank when I realized who stood in front of me. "I'm so sorry," I said, not knowing if he could understand me. He shook his head and spoke. "If you helped, I am thankful. But you died, and you have a chance to live," he said almost sagely. "Finish your business here and take your chance." I looked away from the spirit, and they looked out into the vast desert. There were so many spirits, but I could only see thousands of them, and there could be trillions more. I heard a voice in my head. "Find the seeds." She sounded like she was in distress, but not the kind of distress that came from physical pain, but the kind that came from longing. She sounded so familiar, because she was. I knew in my heart that I must find these seeds, whatever their purpose is, and I felt with everything that is in me that these seeds can one day make things better. Better. I don't know what that means because I don't know what's going on out there. "The seeds cannot be found here." I looked up and there was a creature in front of me. I immediately knew it as the Keeper. This creature was 20 feet large. It had a turtle's shell that glimmered in gold scales. Instead of turtle arms and legs, there were tentacles coming from the shell, multiple tendrils from each of the 6 holes of the shell. And its tendrils looked like they were made of rubies. It had a face like an amethyst fox, with glowing platinum eyes, and it floated above the sandy ground. I am clueless as to how I missed such a strange beast. "What?" I asked it. "You cannot find the tentai seeds here." This one's voice was so close to feminine, but it had a far harder tone to it than any woman I had ever heard before. I blatantly looked around at the vast desert and its mountainous dunes. I wouldn't have thought so initially. "I recognize that you intend to find them. They are in the Dangus Miscus through the gate above." There was an automated tone within the voice as well that was unsettling enough by itself without the beautifully atrocious creature in front of me. It must be talking about that rose-shaped gate that the other being was telling me to go through. I took a deep breath and asked the creature, "You understand thoughts?" "Yes. Who do you wish to see?" There was a serpentine slur to its words with that statement. "My father, and who would then be my father?" The creature closed its eyes, and before me were my father and Allie's father. One smiled, but the other looked sad. Hi, this is David Halem, and you just finished listening to Cloistered Rain from my story, Status Stranded. I hope you enjoyed. See you next week.